Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Goodwin. I am the head of unit of the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at the UN Development Program. I am joined by my colleagues, Richard Bissell and Christine Riddell, who I will let introduce themselves. Rich?
My name is Richard Bissell. I am the lead compliance officer for the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at UNDP.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Riddell, and I'm a research specialist at the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at the UNDP. Nice to see you all.
It's very nice to see everyone. We have a good turnout, almost 40 people, and I imagine a few more will trickle in over the next few minutes. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Especially thank you to the folks over at the IRM at the Green Climate Fund for organizing this and for hosting the GRMs network in general. So we are SECU. We are the Social and Environmental Compliance Unit at the UN Development Program. We are UNDP's independent compliance review function. There is another half to the accountability mechanism at UNDP, which is called the Stakeholder Response Mechanism. And I actually see that Jennifer Laughlin, who heads up the Stakeholder Response Mechanism at UNDP is in the meeting. So hi, Jen. Together, those two offices form UNDP's accountability mechanism. We will just be presenting on, as the compliance unit, but we include a little bit of mention about dispute resolution as well as we move forward. As you can see, there's a wide variety and representation of different types of organizations here. I know that the GRMs network is made up of public entities, private entities, government entities, NGOs, large organizations, small organizations, grievance redress mechanisms that are just getting started, super small, maybe don't even have any case activity yet and only occupy part of one person's time, all the way to larger grievance redress mechanisms that have active caseloads and multiple staff members and dedicated resources and personnel. So welcome to everybody. So the topic of the day is how to manage the relationship between a grievance redress mechanism and its parent institution. As you can see, we've chosen 3 topics to dive into. The first one relates to how you operate as an independent mechanism as a part of a larger institution. The second is focusing on transparency and information disclosure at the GRM and its impact on the parent organization. And the last topic that we're going to talk about is how you manage expectations of the parent institution and other stakeholders. There are obviously many more topics that we could. Yes.
Oh, sorry, not enough here. Slow down a little bit to make it on the sound. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So there are obviously many other topics that we could have focused on. There's lots of dynamics that exist between the parent institution and the grievance redress mechanism. For example, we won't have time to discuss the specific relationship between a grievance redress mechanism and the standards policy team at your institution, the team that's responsible for creating and putting into action applicable social and environmental standards. We hope that that relationship is productive and a separate one. We also won't have time to delve into the relationship between a GRM and other oversight functions at your institution, such as ethics, evaluation, wrongdoing investigations, etc. These relationships are very important, but we had to choose a few topics to focus on today. If anyone has any questions or follow-ups about other topics that we are not able to tackle today, we are, of course, available to have conversations at another time, and as well as topics that we do discuss today. So before we start the presentation, just again, please, if you have any questions, let us know, but we will be having a question and answer discussions period of time after each of the topics. So it'll be a short presentation followed by a short discussion on that topic. And we will have some possible question prompts for everybody to get the conversation started. But of course, if you have any dire questions, please let us know in the chat. So we'll turn it over to Rich to start off on topic 1.
Thanks so much, Paul. And it's a real pleasure to have a chance to kick off our discussion today about how to operate within a parent institution. Issues arise with regard to our GRMs in terms of both the conceptual level as well as a very practical level. And we'll do our best to bring some of those to light today. Next slide. I'd like to frame the discussion of independence today in the context of 2 essential values. As you know from prior webinars, that there has been posed a list of 7 or 8 or perhaps 10 key values that are important for creating a healthy GRM. And in this particular topic, particularly the issue of independence, we focus on because it will affect your ability to be perceived as fair. And secondly, whether or not you yourselves view yourselves or others see you as being effective in terms of meeting the concerns of those who file complaints with you. So these come together under the general heading of independence, and I'll come back to using that term more in the rest of the presentation. I want to focus also on the understanding, which I know each of you appreciate, which is that each institution and each GRM within that institution will have to take its own approach, because independence is not an absolute value. It's not a legal value. It is rather one that goes to the core of your ability to carry out the mandate that you've been given by the institution and implicitly by the civil society and the communities with which you will relate. Next slide. So as you try to explain the benefits of independence to constituencies, both inside and outside your institution, I just want to highlight 4 areas that make it important to be independent. One is that you have access to the staff and to the management of the institution. And this access makes it important both in terms of working with them and understanding what the situation is of the institution and being able to better interpret the policies and standards that drive the institution. The second is to have access to information about current projects, activities. That information is often not available to people outside the institution. And you as an independent but integral part of an institution are able to do so. And it should be fully available to you under your rules and procedures. The third, which is this other side of that coin I just spoke about, is having access to evidence and expertise from outside the institution. That is, the data, the information, the perspectives from inside the institution are only part of your sources that are important for arriving at your findings, at your enumeration of facts and your recommendations for how to proceed on a given complaint. And fourthly, the independence is very important to help the institution and civil society to translate the very high-level institutional policies that govern social and environmental issues into specific situations that affect a community via the project that is being funded by your institution. Next slide. Needless to say, there are various hurdles that tend to arise when you seek independence within an institution. The first is what I call residual distrust of outsiders from an institution. And in an institution, particularly those with a financial background, there is often a traditional secrecy about the proceedings, the decision-making, and the processes that may drive the projects that are designed and implemented. One has to deal and be frank about that residual distrust, because I think those institutions are steadily opening up. And we've seen that happen over the last 25 years, but they still remain, particularly among some of the staff, a certain distrust of outsiders. The second is very specific about a GRM, which is that the mechanism may be seen as cases arise and are resolved as being too independent. This is an issue that will be generated in various formats, and it will come up often articulated in ways that people don't want to attack the concept of independence per se, but rather the way in which the decisions and the reports to the mechanism, the processes may somehow undermine achieving the other goals of the institution. The third, as I briefly mentioned, is that there is no absolute independence. We all recognize in this work that we do that there are gray areas created by the fact that we have to have ties both within the institution as well as with civil society and the communities. And so as a result of the fact that there are gray areas, it becomes a hurdle because it is often debated as to whether or not your judgment is too independent or by some others not independent enough. Fourth is the question of limitations that may be placed on your budget and staffing levels. This can occur in both an overt and its implied way that one has to be sensitive to. But if that happens, it needs to be addressed in order to reinforce your independence. And lastly, in fact, a GRM does not stand on its own through its entire process, because in order to make changes in a project, whether it's resolving a specific complaint through dispute resolution, or whether it's finding ways to bring a project into compliance, ultimately, the institution itself has to be willing to make changes in the projects. Next slide. Let's be honest, there are in fact different sizes of GRMs, and that will affect their ability of a specific GRM to establish an independent role in an institution. Clearly, the large and better established ones, by their size and by their autonomy of staffing and so forth, have a head start in terms of strengthening their independence. And this is to be appreciated. It's a reason for small GRMs, in fact, to have an incentive to grow, because you may be a part-time staff person. You may have an uncertain budget just by virtue of being small and not having a proven track record. So I offer 4 thoughts just as a partial list to think about how one can address that. One is to ensure that part-time staff have specific dedication of time to the GRM function, because otherwise the time may be pushed away and it may be minimized. The second is to establish a reporting line that is separate from line management. It's easy for a GRM to be buried down in the organization chart, when in fact, the decisions that need to occur in the course of carrying out a GRM function it relates to decisions that have been taken at the highest level of the institution, setting policies and carrying out the general direction of the institution. And those are the people that need to hear from you as a GRM. The third is, rather than relying entirely upon internal information, you can identify ways to use consultants that are chosen for their independence, for their expertise, and their credibility in their fields outside the institution, to bring them on board as needed. And it's a way financially, in fact, to make it easier for the institution to accept growth in the GRM function. And the fourth is to recognize the limitations of your function. Even as a GRM matures and it grows, there will always be limitations on what one might call full independence. Next slide. So as we move into the discussion time, I'd like to we would welcome questions or comments that have occurred to you. But here are three that you might think about. First of all, what challenges have you experienced to your independence? Second, how have you addressed such challenges? And thirdly, have you had feedback from civil society about the fairness of your GRM? In the spirit that, in fact, independence is a two-way street. We want to both be independent, both from the institution itself and also from the civil society, the outside, the community that, in fact, bring the issues to you for resolution.
Thanks, Rich. I think we probably should move on to the next session. It's about 8:45 now. So let's do that. Let's go to the next slide. And actually, it's my session. So the second topic that we're going to be talking about relates to transparency and information disclosure at the GRAM and its impact on your parent organization. When we first wrote this topic, the title for the topic, we were intending initially to focus just on the GRM's impact on the parent organization in being a transparent mechanism. But we realized that the impacts go both ways. The transparency of a GRM impacts its parent organization, and then other policies and the reaction of the parent organization impacts the grievance redress mechanism as well. So we're going to dive into both how the GRM and the parent organization impact each other when it comes to issues related to transparency and information disclosure. Next slide, please. So a GRM's transparency processes and characteristics are very important to deliver on its mandate, even if the parent institution that you're located in has a history or practice of being more opaque, and maybe they don't even have current policies and practices that would make it transparent or as transparent as the grievance redress mechanism is aspiring to be and believes that it should be. As you can see here, transparency is itself one of the key pillars of a grievance redress mechanism, but being a transparent mechanism also promotes other key pillars of GRMs, such as independence, which we talked about just before with Rich, access to stakeholders, and fairness to stakeholders and both complainants, civil society, and the parent institution itself. Transparency promotes the independence of the GRM because the decisions that it makes are public. They can be scrutinized by impacted stakeholders, and they can be challenged by people outside of your institutions. It also promotes access to stakeholders because obviously they can access information related to cases and other processes and activity that the mechanism is undertaking, and therefore they can interact better with the decision makers of the GRAM. And lastly, transparency promotes fairness because it evens the informational playing field. As we all know, information and access to that information represents a lot of power and ability to affect change. And so privileged access to information is reduced and external stakeholders are able to have more knowledge about facts and more knowledge about the decisions that are being made related to the activity, the project activity that they are challenging or that they have some type of problem with. Next slide, please. So what does transparency look like at a grievance redress mechanism? How do we build in transparency to a GRM? First, we build it in at the beginning. We try to build in transparent policies and procedures when you're designing your grievance redress mechanism and before you have any cases or controversies, before you attempt dispute resolution activity, and before there would be any questioning as to your motivations for why you're being transparent. This allows for the transparency to be a matter of routine procedure and no one thinks that it's being decided sort of on an ad hoc basis, which could cause objections by people within the parent institution or objections from outsiders if they think that you're not being transparent enough. So it goes both ways. So what are some nuts and bolts that represent transparency at a grievance redress mechanism? Well, it's become standard practice to have an online independent case registry. A case registry is a place where you put all of your open and closed cases and upload relevant documents and information for the world to access. Normally, it's hosted on your parent institution's website, so you will need the technical support of your parent institution to construct the website, but it's often, and it's best practice if it's in a separate location, so it's visually accessible separately from the main web page of the organization. It can be a simple design. It doesn't need to be a very fancy website, but it should be user-friendly and it should be as accessible as possible. And I think very important that only the GRM has access to the registry, to uploading documents, to changing the status of a case, to deleting a case, anything. It should only be the GRM that has access to the registry. Another attribute of transparency at a GRM is that one ensures that decision-making is clear and disclosed. This includes publishing clear investigation guidelines and dispute resolution procedures so that the various steps of a case or a dispute resolution process are spelled out at the beginning, and everybody knows where the important decision points are as the case progresses. Documents that are published should be labeled as coming from the grievance redress mechanism, and that the documents are published and disclosed in a way in which the personnel who are ultimately responsible for various decisions are known. And that way the public and the parent institution can give both blame and credit to the appropriate person and interact with the correct person who's made the various decisions along the way. This can be quite different from the culture of transparency at your parent institution. So it's important to ensure that you are, operating in a way that is, palatable and possible within your parent institution. So there's going to be a wide range of what this level of transparency looks like. Next, there needs to be clear ways to disseminate documents in predictable and routine ways at various points throughout the investigation. This is usually done just by emailing people, but by emailing people, anyone who has an interest in the case, anyone who's made themselves known throughout the course of a case that they would be, interested in updates. And then it's important that you're responsive to questions and, feedback that come in, that you're responding in a timely manner, and that you're responding to the questions and inquiries that come in. And lastly, we try to make sure that we have our documentation in accessible formats in languages that are readable by the impacted communities, and that the communities are obtaining access to relevant documentation in a way with means that work for them. So there are some circumstances where we've had to arrange for a physical printed out document to be delivered to communities if they don't have, modern communications technology, internet, telephone, email, etc. Next slide, please. So what is the value that a transparent GRM brings to a parent organization? We think that there are lots of values that the parent organization experiences from having a transparent GRM. The first one relates to the clarity of logic regarding findings and recommendations. The organization and people within it can disagree about cases and about outcomes of cases. But if the mechanism is transparent, then it promotes transparent arguments and debate within the organization and between the organization and outside stakeholders about how to proceed. And this in turn averts and prevents and helps mitigate, reputational challenges, scandals, and it builds trust for the organization. Since the mechanism forms a part of that parent organization, and the organization has chosen to create this mechanism. So it forms part of that trust building between stakeholders. And I think especially in the wide variety of organizations that are part of the GRM network, many institutions do not have a history and practice of full transparency. It's just not part of the background of that organization. And so when a grievance redress mechanism promotes transparency, it often can encourage an organization to adopt more transparent practices, which in turn, instills more trust between the organization and other partners, and other institutions and organizations are going to be more willing to partner with, work with, have trust in, give money to the parent institution if there is this transparent system of accountability taking place. We also think that a transparent GRM promotes long-term project success. We've seen historically that too often our institutions are seen as sort of big black boxes where communications go to be buried and not responded to, and that institutions historically have only responded to select communications from certain people, and oftentimes inadequate responses about project activity that's impacting certain people in certain areas. And that imperils the development process and the success of projects. Community buy-in, as we know, is extremely important for project success. And if communities are opposed to project activity and feel that they can't understand what projects are about or what project activity is going to be, that's more likely to increase opposition to projects and threaten their success. We've seen that often in the history of development projects. Transparent GRMs also promote credible, they represent a credible fact-finding mechanism. Stakeholders oftentimes are simply seeking a clarification of facts and an independent assessment of what the reality on the ground is. If a GRM is viewed as transparent and credible, the parent organization can benefit from having a place to go to resolve contradictory narratives. Oftentimes an organization itself, people within it have different opinions, different interests, and different viewpoints, and having sort of a neutral, transparent, fair place to try to make sense of complicated, contentious issues can be a real benefit to the organization. And that helps the institution navigate a path forward. And lastly, I think that this shouldn't be understated. A grievance redress mechanism is a place to refer press and civil society inquiries. A lot of the times we at UNDP or SECU within UNDP received referrals from journalists or civil society organizations that have questions about projects that are being complained about. And it is credible for UNDP management and for the UNDP External Relations Office to simply refer that inquiry to SECU and to ask us what is this case about? What is this controversy? And if we have established a transparent system where all of our case information is already published on our registry, we in turn simply need to say, well, you can go to the case registry and see all of the documentation that's already public about this case. And that will give you a clear sense of the issues at play and where the current investigation, or in the SRM's case, the dispute resolution process stands, where it stands. And that is a very seamless way to handle inquiries from journalists or civil society organizations. Next slide, please. So what is the relationship between a GRM's transparency procedures and its parent institution's information disclosure policies? So as I'm sure many of your institutions have, there are certain presumptions to disclose information and documentation or not. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes a very secretive institution may have a presumption to keep documentation confidential. And then there will be a list of exemptions so that, certain categories of documents are either presumed confidential or not, depending on the policies. And I imagine some of your institutions have either extremely rudimentary information disclosure policies or possibly none at all. It just depends. It's important to remind ourselves that a GRM is subject to your parent institution's information disclosure policy. We are not a conduit to just publish any document that we want that happens to be related to a case if it is properly classified as confidential documentation. But as we know, what's written down as a policy is often vague or subject to interpretation and real life application. So the question that I have for everyone listening is it well defined and is it clearly enforced who at your institution interprets and decides what information, what documentation can be disclosed? Are there different types of information that are treated differently? Some institutions possess documents and information that is not owned, that is not controlled ultimately by the institution. So they need to take very careful consideration about how to deal with those documents. Some information is strictly confidential because it could cause, harm, loss, or it could be slanderous to someone if it was released. Other information is simply that the parent organization would rather it just not be out there because it might be embarrassing or it might be confusing or it might indicate other issues, even though it might be presumed to be disclosable. So who at your organization interprets and decides how to publish certain information? And will your GRM, will your GRAM have the mandate or have the power to interpret your parent institution's information disclosure policy as you navigate a case and attempt to maintain a high level of transparency in the work that you're doing within the context of your own parent institution's levels of transparency and disclosure? Just the last slide before we do get to the Q&A. It's also important to manage your GRM's relationship with the public relations department of your institution. A parent organization can often refer inquiries to the grievance redress mechanism, but it's important to recognize that a PR department's job is to emphasize good news and to mitigate bad news. And that is not what the grievance redress mechanism's job is. So there should be clear lines that are established between the grievance redress mechanism and the public relations or external relations department within your institution. The public needs to believe that the GRM isn't just part of the parent organization's public relations response, or else it won't be viewed as credible, independent, or really serving any purpose other than being a talking piece for the parent institution. And in those situations, the complainants and communities and external stakeholders will simply have no confidence that the GRM is independent and doing its job. And that would just undermine its ability to resolve disputes and settle cases in a fair manner. Next slide. So these are a few questions that we've put up to get the discussion started, the Q&A. I'll just quickly go through them, but please feel free to ask anything that you're interested in. So what does transparency look like at your parent institution, and how might this affect transparency at your grievance redress mechanism? As we found out at the beginning of the hour, there's a wide variety of institutional contexts in which you're operating. How does your institution's policies on information disclosure conflict with your procedures? How will you resolve that? Are there presumptions to disclose or presumptions to keep documents confidential that you'll have to navigate in your investigative and dispute resolution work? For those of you who have begun to or have already crafted transparency policies for your GRM, has anybody faced pushback from your institutions? What was it? how did you respond? How did the institution respond? What was ultimately settled on? And lastly, how might a newly created and transparent GRM impact the culture of transparency and accountability at your parent institution and vice versa? And again, that might be an exercise in speculation, or you might have experienced it firsthand, how these forces have interacted with each other. Okay, over to you, Christine.
Great, thanks, Paul. All right, so we're going to turn it over to topic 3. If I can have the next slide, please. Great. So we're going to talk about managing expectations with your parent organization while executing the mandate of your grievance mechanism. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about managing expectations throughout the entire complaints handling process. Now, these could be expectations as to the outcomes of the process, expectations around who and how you will engage with stakeholders, or expectations around what's justifiable for a grievance mechanism to even spend their money on. Now, there will be key moments or opportunities throughout the complaints handling process where you will need to manage expectations, particularly from your parent institution, but also the expectations of your external stakeholders. Out of the principles, so the many principles, and we've heard these in other sessions for effective grievance mechanisms, I think it's most important to emphasize and manage expectations around your independence, fairness, and credibility. Now, before we get into the key moments or the key opportunities for managing expectations, it's important to recognize that there's an inherent imbalance in the way that most grievance mechanisms are structured. So grievance mechanisms are expected to act independently, they're expected to be fair to all stakeholders. Yet a grievance mechanism, as you know, and as you're all aware in terms of your setting, is not located halfway between the parent institution and the community or the other stakeholders. The grievance mechanism is located within the parent institution. Now, that means that you will need to take certain steps right at the outset and throughout the process to level the playing field in terms of access, transparency, and your own responsiveness. So while you can walk down the hallway to better understand the perspective of colleagues within your institution, you can't do this with other stakeholders who are located outside of your institution, and you can't do this with the complainant. Now, as SECU, there are certain ways that we try to address this to ensure that there's balance throughout the process. And these can be as simple but costly sometimes as going to meet the complainant in person. So we have to justify to our institution that the cost of travel and the cost of meeting people face to face is justified because it's part of leveling this playing field. We also have to make sure, as Paul mentioned, in terms of the transparency side, that we are communicating in languages that are used by the people that we are dealing with. And that has to be justified in terms of we need to spend money on translators, we need to have interpreters. So it's part of managing that expectation around what you need to do right at the outset to level that playing field. And these measures are important for both ensuring independence, but also creating trust and enhancing the credibility of your grievance mechanism. And we need to emphasize the need for and importance of these measures with our parent institution. Next slide, please. Now, each GRM will be structured differently, and you may not all have the mandates that I'm going to talk about. But I want to go through a range of opportunities or moments for managing expectations that I see playing out in the exercise of these different mandates. You may think to yourself, I don't really do dispute resolution, informal problem solving is not part of my mandate, or you might not have a formal compliance review mandate, as I know that many grievance mechanisms don't. But there might be something in what I'm saying that sounds similar to a process that you have, and you might see an opportunity for yourself when I'm explaining that. So we'll start with dispute resolution, or sometimes it's called problem solving, which is really any point in your process where your grievance mechanism is trying to flexibly address an issue without making a formal finding of non-compliance. Now, when you're problem solving, it's important to have regard to mediation principles, even if you're not a mediator. And the point here is that when you're mediating an issue, you're facilitating dialogue with the goal of being a neutral facilitator. When you're flexibly solving an issue, you want to let the stakeholders drive the process to a degree, and you want to see yourself as the steering force and not a rigid rule setter. But going back to what I said earlier, it's very important at this stage of the process, particularly to ensure that you're creating this equal opportunity for engagement. Don't fall into the trap of letting your institution have a greater role to play and letting your colleagues at the institution influence you. If you're having a cup of coffee with a colleague in the institution and you're discussing the case with them, you will not be seen as an independent facilitator in this process, regardless of what your intentions may be. So you need to be clear with your institution that you are an independent facilitator, and you may need to educate them on the importance of creating an equal playing field, justifying why you need to meet with the complainant separately, why you need to spend money on travel, and why you may need to spend more time with the complainants at the outset to bring them to the level of the institution. So guiding them through the process, sharing resources with them, for example. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the compliance review or investigations phase. And in this phase, what you're doing, if you have this in your mandate, or maybe you have part of this in your mandate, you're usually trying to assess whether or not your institution complied with its own policies and procedures. And in this phase, you need to remember that there's going to be a risk that your institution will be more defensive in the process. And that individual colleagues in particular might view you as assessing whether or not they did their job correctly. So there's likely to be more defensiveness when dealing with a compliance review. And you'll need to remember that not all threats to your independence in this process are going to be overt threats. So the erosion of your independence can also come through disguised offers to collaborate from the institution. You might find your colleagues reaching out to you, offering to sit down with you, have meetings together, address the concerns, engage in learning lessons from the process. And this is all very well, but at this stage of the process, this is not the time for those discussions. You need to safeguard your position as an independent fact-finding body when you're doing a compliance review. You're recommending corrective actions as part of that compliance review, but those should be recommended as part of your report, not as part of an informal process going through your compliance review. And if your institution has already started to take corrective action as a result of your investigation, then they can respond to that when they receive the report. They can say, we've already taken steps, this is what we're doing. But it's still very important that those findings are made and that you classify them as such in your report. So you're looking at past action, you're saying, this is what went wrong, this is what should have been done, and you're still making those findings of fact and those findings about breach of standards. You need to be firm in managing the expectations so that your institution knows that they cannot influence your recommendations. So this means that, for example, a lot of grievance mechanisms have an opportunity where they share the report, they share their draft compliance report before publishing it to the public. And they do that usually with both the institution and with the complainant. And it's very important that that opportunity exists for both sides. But when we're sharing that report, it's important to resist attempts to influence the outcomes or attempts to influence the recommendations of our report. So your institution might have specific comments about the facts, and they might say, we have more information about this point, you didn't correctly classify this, or you didn't correctly characterize it rather. But it's important that you don't give the institution an opportunity there to influence the findings or the recommendations, but just the facts, if you're going to provide an opportunity to fact check. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk very quickly about outreach. And outreach is a very important mandate to have, and we've talked a little bit about this throughout the session. And most grievance mechanisms will have an outreach mandate. And if they don't, or if you are sitting here thinking, I don't have an outreach mandate, then it's very important that you do. The goal of an outreach mandate is to raise awareness amongst potential complainants about the existence of your mechanism. Now, this is a necessary mandate, again, to address this unequal access to information and this unequal power balance between the institution and other stakeholders. It's a mandate that requires resources, so you need to raise this issue of how important it is with your institution, if it's something that you need to get budget for. And your institution needs to recognize that there's no point in establishing a grievance mechanism unless people know that it exists. And going back to the point made earlier, this is something that you can raise with whoever established your institution. So making sure that that is accepted and that budget is provided for it. At the same time, your institution, while making budget available for outreach, needs to understand that outreach activities are a safe space for potential complainants to learn about the mechanism and raise concerns without any fear of retaliation from the institution. Now, to maintain your independence, your mechanism needs to host these outreach events on its own in a way that communicates to the outside world that you are an independent part of this institution. And you need to manage expectations that your institution might have about joining these activities. And this will often be the case, and sometimes it's done in a very, it's done because they think that it's important that they're part of these events or they want to know about these events, but it's important to manage those expectations about the safe space that you're creating. At the same time, you should also consider opportunities for what we call in-reach activities. So opportunities that are dedicated to educating your colleagues about the role that you play in the institution. So you can consider hosting webinars or brown bag lunches where you can talk about your work and the benefits of having a grievance mechanism to your colleagues in the institution. You can also use this as an opportunity to explain to your colleagues what their role in the process will be so that they understand the process and they understand what is expected of them. Next slide, please. So lastly, and I know we're starting to run out of time, but most grievance mechanisms, usually the more resourced and established ones, will have an advisory function. So they'll have a mandate to provide advice to the institution. So you might not specifically have this mandate, but there might be other less formal opportunities for you to provide advice. And advice is usually given based on lessons learned through handling cases. So if you look at the way that the mandate is crafted amongst grievance mechanisms with established procedures, it usually says you will give advice based on lessons learned on handling cases, because this is your grievance mechanism's area of expertise, and your experience of institutional issues through handling cases gives you credibility, or gives credibility to what you have to say. And your goal in exercising this mandate should be to be helpful to the institution, helping them deliver on their commitments. While giving advice can be an opportunity to have a broader influence within your institution because it's not limited to the specific issues of a complaint, you still should be targeted in your approach, so targeted in the advice you give. If you stray too far from what's reasonably within your area of expertise and use this function merely to criticize your institution, this is where you might lose credibility within the institution. So when exercising your mandate, you need to draw on your powers of persuasion by grounding your evidence or your advice in evidence and experience to make a strong argument for your case. It's often useful to frame these advice discussions in a non-threatening way to help increase uptake and willingness to implement the advice. So this is a function where you can be more collaborative in the good sense of the word, not in the sneaky sense of the word. You're not assessing a specific incident of non-compliance, but rather trying to distill lessons for the future and advising on the ways that the institution can better deliver on its promises. So those are just some tips and some advice on different moments within your mechanism where you can shape the response or shape those expectations. All right, so I think we'll have to end it there. Thank you all very much from me, and I'm going to hand over to Lalanath for some closing remarks, and I think he would like to do a photo as well. So thank you all. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let me first thank all of our participants for having joined and stayed with us for pretty much the entire session. We will have more webinars next year, and we are going to have a meeting of our GRAM partnership leaders to decide on what the next year's program will be. Amongst them, we really do want to issue some good practice notes. I mean, codify some of the learning we've had in these webinars into written form so that you will have it readily available to you. But all of these webinars are available by way of videos, which you can access later, and the presentations are available to you as well. That said, let me now turn to SECU and say you have been great GRAM partners with us from the beginning. Been lovely collaborating with you on these GRAM partnership events. And as part of the partnership. But for today's program, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Christine, for your presentations and the hard work that went into preparing it. And we really appreciate the sharing that you did today and in responding to the questions. And finally, a word of thanks to my own staff who have been behind the scenes working to ensure that everything goes well. Thank you also to our translators who have helped to facilitate these sessions and ensure that the knowledge can be shared in the language that you best understand. So with that, happy holidays and a good new year to all of you, and keep in touch. We will meet again in the next year. Thank you and good night, good morning. Have a good day.